So anyway, we're welcome to another in our Wednesday speaker series. And our guest this evening is Bill Duncan. I was thinking, how am I going to introduce Bill? There's a lot I could say. So what I did, I went to the New Hampshire Board of Education website. This is Bill's official bio, and I'm going to read that and then I'll make a few comments. Here goes. Bill Duncan is a retired technology entrepreneur and the founder of Advancing New Hampshire Public Education, which was Defending New Hampshire Public Education, dedicated to advocating for public education in the state. Born in Boston, he graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy and served in Vietnam as an advisor to the Vietnamese Navy before starting a business and nonprofit career. He founded and for 12 years led the Mountain Association for Community Economic Development, a leading economic development organization creating jobs and housing for low-income families in Central Appalachia. In that role, he organized 100 Eastern Kentucky banks to provide subsidized financing housing for low-income families in Central Appalachia, and founded Forward in the Fifth, the first education advocacy organization dedicated to building common ground among parents, administrators, and teachers in hard-pressed mountain schools. Mr. Duncan moved to New Hampshire in 1986 to join his childhood friend Bob Morgan in establishing the hospitality software company New Market Software. In 1994, he founded Daylight Software, selling the company in 2005. Mr. Duncan lives in Newcastle and is on the board of New Hampshire Kids Count, formerly New Hampshire Children's Alliance, and the Prescott Park Arts Festival. He is the recipient of numerous awards, including both a 2014 Business and Industry Association of New Hampshire Above and Beyond Award for helping to shape BIA's goals of improving education standards. He also won the National Education Association of New Hampshire's 2014 Communications Award, which said that Bill believes that the best advocates for public education are public educators, and he works tirelessly to be sure that our voices are heard. So I've known Bill since 2007, 2008. I live in Portsmouth, he lives in Newcastle, and Bill's been active in the Democratic Party for a good time now. And we worked together on the Cow-Shaped Border campaign for years. But back in 2011, after the debacle of the 2010 elections, when Bill O'Brien was the Speaker of the House, the bad old days, Bill was like single-handedly leading the battle to protect public education in New Hampshire. He set up a website defending New Hampshire public education, and he waged a really courageous battle, and I think that he's gained a lot of respect and support along the way. And one thing I've learned is, you know, if Bill puts his mind to something, you don't want to be on the other side. And so I think that we're all really fortunate to have Bill fighting the good fight for us for public education. So he's going to be talking about the challenges facing public education in New Hampshire, and we're going to do it a little differently. Normally I ask the speaker, hey, just give your talk, and we'll do questions later. But Bill would like this to be more interactive, and that's fine with me. So he'll just ask your questions whenever, and at some point we will pass the hat, because we've got to do that. So anyway, Bill, take it away.
My humble mission these days is to try to connect some dots, things that are happening in New Hampshire public education right now that may not be obvious if you stand farther away from the action. And I want to make it so that you can follow the action through the newspaper, through conversations with friends, and see what it's really adding up to and not be distracted by mixed messages that come out from all the different directions, from the state board, from the Department of Education, from the legislature. And I want to try to just put that together. Since the O'Brien days, there has been a hard core of folks who disagree with almost anything, any policy, any enhancement to New Hampshire public education. And most of the action has been in the legislature. And that first year that I was active, I got active in 11, but it was the 2012 legislature where the voucher bill came to a vote. And there were 40 other bills, anti-education bills, all of which we were able to defeat, except the voucher bill. As people probably know, there's a small voucher program going on, tax credit funded vouchers. Ever since then, it hasn't got much support, but it continues to go on. But the folks who supported that continue to question public education policy. So when you saw the Common Core debates over the last several years, yes, it was about standards, but standards was fodder, was a detail. The issue was to challenge the legitimacy of public education in general, and of course, here in New Hampshire in particular. People opposed the International Baccalaureate as a curriculum. You may have tuned into that debate. There was one debate, the test, the annual test, Smart and Balanced, was a political debate as well. And it continues. The larger picture is a matter of undercutting the public's support for and confidence in public education. In last year, 2016, Chris Sununu was elected governor. Oh, I should say that when Maggie was elected, the following January, I was appointed to the State Board of Education. So I'd been active as an advocate. I ran next to Maggie for our different offices. We've been political friends and mutual supporters for years, of course. And when a vacancy came up on the State Board, she appointed me. So since then, I've been on the board. And there came to be an opportunity to establish two key organizations in support of public education. One works in the public sphere, that's Reaching Higher in New Hampshire, which I hope you've heard about, but if you haven't, we can talk about it. And the other is the New Hampshire Learning Initiative, which is much less visible, but it works with school districts on advancing their innovation agenda. And innovation in New Hampshire is about competency-based education, personalizing learning for each student, and changing assessments to be geared to really finding out what each student knows instead of the top-down annual assessments that we've had up to now. It's that kind of thing, and it's a lot of work. I see Kevin here, who can talk about Kevin, come back from your phone.
I'm sorry.
who can chime in on classroom experience whenever the occasion arises. But there's a lot of work for teachers and administrators and students in the big changes that have occurred in New Hampshire public education now and are in the process of occurring. And as a result, New Hampshire is the national leader and this is not idle xenophobia, it's the real deal, national leader in making these kinds of changes that really respond to where students need support and need opportunities to excel. So into that narrative rides a new politics of 2017. Chris Sununu was elected governor, and we have a straight Republican legislature. And the folks who have opposed public education all along now have a larger palette to work on. And the key event there was the appointment of a new Commissioner of Education, Frank Edelblut, and a new chairman of the State Board of Education, Drew Klein. Drew being a very good, both of them, very good guys. They're serious, hardworking folks who have a different view of education than some of us, but are going about their jobs in a very serious way. And that means we are now at a turning point, a potential turning point in the path of New Hampshire public education. All these policies I've been talking about are policies that the constituency who elected Governor Sununu, and as probably everyone in this room knows, Frank Edelblut ran against Chris Sununu in the primary and came within 500 votes, 800 votes of defeating him. And was a big, strong supporter of the governor's, through the current governor, through his campaign for governor. So wanted only one thing as in return, and that is this office as Commissioner of Education. So it brings an entirely new way of thinking about education to the forefront in the state. But some of the words overlap, and it's easy to miss the change, and that's what I want to talk about. Ever since, people now talk about our public education system as leftover from the industrial age. We're now in the information age, digital age, careers changing by the minute, preparing our kids for the future. How will the school system respond? The New Hampshire public education system is leading the way in showing how to do that. Our schools see themselves as in the business of developing students with what's called 21st century skills. You may hear them called soft skills, but it is creativity, teamwork, in addition to academic excellence, and a number of other skills that are important in civic life, family life, business life, work life. But these kinds of skills are suspect to those who question the role of public education. And we're now in a debate about whether to invest in our public system of education and say that we have developed from the Puritans on a system whose responsibility is to the community, whose responsibility is to our kids, as Bob Putnam called them in his great recent book, right? To our neighbors' kids, to each other. We're in this together, and we're going to make our schools as good as we can make them for all of our kids. But now, the voices have come to the fore which say, not so fast. It is rugged individualism that got us to where we're at. And each parent ought to be able to choose the education and construct and design the education for his or her own children. So instead of a community asset, we would have our public schools would become one of the vendors for an individual asset. Each child might go to a charter school, a voucher-funded private school, a home school, online learning, and where needed, a public school, maybe. This is called school choice. You've all heard it called school choice. And it sounds like everyone's right in a way, and it sounds benign. But it represents a sharp fork in the road that it's now time for people to tune in to the meaning of it, to the extent that people in New Hampshire want to take that fork. They ought to be able to, we ought to be able to decide that as a community. But sliding into it, kind of unawares, that would be the mistake, and that's what I'm talking about here. So, Commissioner Edelblut and State Board Chairman, okay, something about the board. There are 7 members of the State Board of Education, 1 from each Executive Council district and 2 at large. And I said a minute ago that all the action about the public education debate used to be in the legislature, and it did. Now it's at the state board as well, and in order to keep track, you need to keep track of what goes on at the state board as well as in the legislature, and I'll be saying more about that. I'll give you 2 examples of exactly why. And the third place it's happening is in your local school districts. There are 275 school districts. There are 85 school administrative units, right, SAUs, superintendents, but there are 275 school districts combined into those administrative units. And each of those school districts has any number of, there are 800 plus school board members. And there is now a well-armed force, well-organized force, I should say, to elect folks who oppose our traditional way of thinking about our school districts. Elect them to the budget committees and the school boards, and to bring either an anti-tax voice or other voices that bring this new conversation into the school districts. So there are all of these levels at which this conversation is being carried out. And Susan, is that right? From Newton, is at ground zero in one of these cases. Sanborn Regional School District has been one of the leading school districts in the state to move into the future and give their students an opportunity to lift off in response to a new kind of teaching. But over the last couple of school board elections, opponents to this kind of forward movement have been elected, and there's no telling what will happen there. And that's happened in other places like Nashua and Manchester, so it can happen anywhere. So, yes?
Well, 2 of my granddaughters graduated from Sanborn, and I have one granddaughter there, so it's good to hear. But what is the forward?
Okay,
what
yeah,
is that?
yeah. It's the embodiment of those policies that I was talking about, competency-based education to get, I know it sounds like jargon, but what it means is that instead of lecturing, the teacher coaches the student who owns his or her own work. Says, my goal for today, for this week, for this month, is to learn this, to multiply fractions, now divide fractions. And like in the first grade, second grade, third grade, you can have children talking about their goals, both for communicating, cooperating, learning arithmetic, and this is a way of personalizing education, and it changes the role of the teacher entirely, from lecturer to coach, and it changes everything about what happens in the classroom. It's a long, arduous process for the leadership, and Sanborn has been, still is, far down the road in doing that. And if you want to replace, people talk about too much testing. If you want to replace testing with something more constructive, which again, the jargon is that you can give performance assessments all year. And these are projects, these are multi-step, complex problems that students solve that do as much teaching as they do testing. So the assessment, the teacher's understanding of what your child knows and doesn't know is embodied in this kind of assessment, and she can go right to that need of your child or your child or your child. This is very deep work, and Sanborn has been, I would say, one of the leaders. Rochester, Epping, Concord, a number of other school districts are way down this road. And to the extent that school boards get elected that challenge that, or don't believe in it or don't understand it, the tide can go back out on that kind of change. Does that answer your question? In other words, or not? It looks like it didn't.
Well, my granddaughter was actually on the school board. She was the student representative, and then my sister was on the school board as well. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I didn't know that they were so.
From a distance, in fact, there's a great article in yesterday's Concord Monitor explaining competency-based report cards. Because instead of ABC in English, you get a 1 to 4 in how good you are at writing discursive essays, or in multiplying or dividing by fractions in the 5th grade. Right? You get all this detailed feedback as a parent, but the teacher gets that, and the teacher knows what to work on with you. So check that out, Lola Dufour in the Concord Monitor. So these are big, heavy lifting kind of policies that take a long time. This has been a movement most alive in New Hampshire since 2005. And since this is the live free or die state, we support and help. We don't mandate from the top down. So it takes a long time and real leadership to bring this along. And Virginia Barry, who is the immediate past commissioner, was in that role of education, was in that role for 8 years, and did that kind of work with the superintendents and others all during that time. Yes, Lincoln.
So has this been in effect in enough districts or enough of the state to be able to either do comparative analysis or to do any kind of a measure of whether or not
whether it works?
Yes, yeah. Thank you.
It's in enough districts, but there's not enough time yet, right? And so what you do is go to the schools and get testimony, right? And but for instance, a UNH, wonderful young UNH student did a study of the impact of performance assessments replacing the annual Smarter Balanced, in this case, the annual assessment that we've had ever since No Child Left Behind. And what is the impact? Special ed kids pulled right up even in, I forget whether it was English or math now, I think it was math, with kids who weren't on special ed in scoring, in their achievement levels. And the reason is what I'm talking about, this natural building. Special ed isn't something so much off to the side anymore, right? Kids can be integrated and the teacher can reach kids at the high end of needing challenge and at the end of needing a lot of support in a natural way. And so you get rigorous academic results like that, but they're just beginning to come in their pieces. So but the schools that are in a group of schools using these performance assessments, like Sanborn, are seeing increases in their annual assessment scores compared to before. Education is, as you know, complex to measure, but in a rough way, you see good results, and if you talk with the teachers and the administrators, they say uniformly, this was very, very hard work. This continues to be hard work, this change, but it's the right work, it's rewarding.
Teachers and administrators, or?
Say that again?
Hard work for whom?
Hard work for the teachers.
Oh, okay.
It's hard work for everybody,
right.
But it's a big, the teacher is on the front, right? And so it's the teacher who's really got to make the big changes. The Common Core standards themselves were big, big change for teachers. And the way that they became embedded in the classroom was unlike any way they had used standards typically in the past. So that was a big change. Then when you talk about competency, I don't get to go to chapter 10 and lecture you and test you in the way that I've done since Kevin got hired and so on.
Well, that's the question is teacher training.
Yes.
Yeah, that's where I was going to ask.
Yeah, it's a big investment.
You can argue whether good or bad, whatever it might be, but you've already got teachers in the classroom.
The NEA, which represents 16,000, 17,000 teachers and other educators in New Hampshire, is in the forefront of retraining teachers. They're a partner for the department and everyone else in moving this whole thing forward. It's a very big retraining undertaking.
I was actually going to ask the teacher in the room who's in a school district who's already in the forefront of it, how she feels about it, and to your point, what kind of training she went through to get here.
Who's the teacher?
I thought it was this young lady. Didn't you say she was on the front line?
No. She used to be on the school board when her kids were on the board, and now she's organizing a Democratic committee.
Oh.
Yes.
I'm a retired third grade teacher. It's been 10 years, and then I subbed for 6 years, but this sounds like the way we taught before, truthfully. I mean, that's how I taught.
Yes.
It was differentiated, it was performance-based, and I actually wrote questions for the math kneecap because I didn't like the way the questions were formed, and we addressed that. But this sounds like it's kind of like coming full circle.
Old-time real teachers, that's what they say.
Exactly what we did. So when I hear that, it's like innovative.
And this is, the goal of this is to do what you used to do.
Literature circles.
And to get testing out of the way,
right,
and make it really respond to the needs of students.
Well, one thing, when I was writing the question for kneecap for math, which is not my forte, trust me, I did it because I didn't like the questions. They were geared very high and they were tricky. They were trying to trick them, and I told them, you're not gaining anything. The kids are crying. And so we would work a day on one question. But they said, please tell your teachers, do not teach to the test.
Yes, exactly.
Be an extraordinary teacher and, teach everything that they need to know, because the test changes every year.
Right.
Like I remember one year all we did we taught graphs, because one question was on graphs.
Right.
And we did that all year, and then they had no questions on graphs the next year, so.
No. One of my favorite conversations was with a sophomore at Concord High who was telling me about her performance assessment in science. It had to do with lizards and islands, and it's not just an old lab, it's a real data gathering, and you work together with your teammates to figure out some stuff, and then you write your own. It's a multi-day, complex undertaking, and she was very excited about it. And I said, well, what if you had the same thing in math? She said, oh, no, we could never do that. The teacher tells us about how this equation works, and we fill in the equation. And I said, yeah, but what about if you designed a water tower and you had to figure out this and that? And she said, oh, the teacher, that would change everything. But yeah, that's the point, right? And so it does change everything to engage students in this kind of real-life problem solving with big, multi-step problems. Big in the sense that they can be several hours or several weeks, right, where the students are engaged, but they have to use their creativity, and they have to use their develop and use their problem-solving ability. So it's a whole other way of teaching. But of course, you need to believe in the system. You need to believe that this kind of training, this kind of investment in our public education system is worthwhile to put all of this kind of structure in place to reach not just kids who would go to a charter school over here or get homeschooled over here, but all the kids in the state, in this case 170,000. So, go ahead, Nick.
Well, I just wanted to take it sort of up the ladder a little bit and ask you, because the teachers that are teaching this, it strikes me, or at least as likely, that's not how they were trained.
That's right.
And so my question is, what is happening with teaching teachers, colleges and certification, and where's that?
There are 12 or 14 teachers' colleges, as we used to call them, in New Hampshire. They are all engaged in learning this way of teaching. And they now, I wouldn't say it's all done, but they're all invested. This was a big undertaking. Changing a system like this is a huge undertaking, including the kind of questions you've been asking and including this one. So the short answer, because I want to get on to this, is that they're deeply engaged. The last person I talked to about this was Monday morning, in the Department of Education at UNH. And you would hear these words coming back from deep within the way he teaches today. So this is what is at risk. If you think that a superior value, a value superior to community good done through this community asset, is individual choice and shopping from this computer company or that homeschool company or that charter school or private school paid by vouchers, if you think that that opportunity for choice is superior to building this state but national asset, then you will talk in a certain way. And it isn't always immediately recognizable. So I want to read you a quote from Betsy DeVos. Everybody knows how Betsy thinks, right? But she doesn't breathe fire minute to minute, right? It isn't like every minute is a swing of the axe. Here is what she said to the American Federation for Children back in May. The time has expired for reform. We need a transformation that will open up America's closed and antiquated education system. Now, I was talking with a group of educators and business people a week ago, in which one leader, whose name you would recognize, stopped me and said, wait a minute, I agree with that, right? What's to disagree with there? Okay. If we really want to help students, then we need to focus everything about education on individual students. Lo and behold, what have we been just talking about for the last, right? And funding, supporting, and investing in them. This is where it gets a little thicker. Funding, supporting, and investing in them. If you've ever heard money follows the child, that's what she just said, right? If your kid goes to Somersworth High gets the state adequacy and the tax money, call it $15,000. And if your child goes to a neighboring private school, that same $15,000 goes there. That's money follows the child, right? That's what she's talking about. But you wouldn't know that necessarily, right? And she goes on, she's saying, funding, supporting, and investing, not in buildings, not in systems. And to me, the money quote is systems, not in systems. Meaning, not in the system we've been talking about, right? It shouldn't matter where the student learns, so long as they are actually learning. Now you see how attractive that quote is in many ways? And how it can seem like, gee, what's so bad about that? Except if it means that every parent is his or her own school system, which is what it means, then it's actually an alternative to the whole education system we've been developing since the 1600s. So, and there are many signs of this if you know how to read them. And that's what I see as my job, as a translator, right? In August, after the August State Board meeting, a constituent called me to ask why Ken Gurrell, and I've got this written down because his quotes, I'm going to give you his quotes, why Kenneth Gurrell, a school choice advocate and opponent of diversity in our schools, would be appointed to the Professional Standards Board. Nobody knows, if you don't know what the State Board of Education looks like, you will never have heard of the Professional Standards Board, but it sets the qualifications for teachers. If you want to be a teacher in New Hampshire, and if you want to graduate with a certificate, and you want to be an elementary school teacher, here are the qualifications. High school, science, English, everything. It's a lot of work. And they are an advisory group, and an important work. And they're an advisory group to the State Board, which is the board that officially writes these standards, writes these rules. So Ken is now on that board. What I say here is the committee that advises the board on teacher certification rules, which is exactly what it is. When you do some searching, you find that Mr. Gurrell talks of education as the only product that costs more and gets worse. He says that American educators brainwash our kids as totalitarian students. He characterizes diversity as a weakness compared to the strength he sees in rugged individualism that helped build this country. 4 years ago, I discovered that he had characterized support for public education as propaganda in fealty to one education system. Now, if you're not paying close attention, you think, oh, you know, he's an anti-education guy and what's going on. You hear that one education system. That's your system. That's our system. It's meant to be merely one education system next to the others I've been talking about. Publicly funded, private, etc. Charters and everything else. By the way, we've got great charter schools here in New Hampshire. This is not an anti-charter school discussion. It is just that how many education systems can you afford? Mr. Gorell has no children or experience with teachers. And so that's one case, right? I had to agree with his constituent who said, wait a minute. And his nomination had been put forward. The commissioner always kind of does this work, brings them forward. And the state board normally just goes along, right? Because we've all been on the same wavelength. We've had a consensus. We've had a shared vision. That vision that we've been talking about the future of public education in the state. So when the commissioner brings forward 10 new nominees, you don't worry about it. You just vote for them as a board. Embedded in that 10 in August was Mr. Gorell. So now, when we get these nominees, I call them, I can interview them, just as you would for an executive council appointment. But then, in September, this is very arcane sounding, but interesting, about local school boards. At our September board meeting, we heard an appeal from a dissident member of the Timberlane Regional and the SAU 55 school boards, right? So Timberlane's got its own school board, but it's part of SAU 55. Her name is Donna Green, Mrs. Donna Green. Ms. Green seeks to limit the superintendent's hiring authority, but she doesn't have the votes on her local school board. Her appeal asked to have the State Board of Education overrule her local school board because she lost the vote. I've never seen this before, and I venture to say that people who have been on the board longer than I have never seen it. By statute, the State Board of Education adjudicates disputes between school boards or between school boards and teachers in certain cases. The board also hears appeals having to do with bullying and something called manifest educational hardship. Don't yawn. It's going to be important. I'll tell you in a minute. But that's the kind of appeals it hears. The State Board, however, does not referee disagreements among members of each of our many school boards. But interestingly, as Mrs. Green presented her case, Commissioner Edelblut intervened to make her case for her. He intervened saying, now just to clarify, and then he went on referring to statute and trying to justify her appeal. The Commissioner of the Department of Education has no role in these hearings. No commissioner has ever intervened in a hearing before the State Board. The board has 7 members. That's all that's on the board. It's not that it doesn't involve the commissioner. So he made his case for her. Then when Attorney Jim O'Shaughnessy presented the board's case, why this case should be dismissed, the commissioner intervened again, and he said, I think there is a basis for this appeal. And he went on imitating a lawyer, making the case for the appeal. So, for the board, though, this was not a close call. The vote to dismiss Mrs. Green's appeal was not an anti-parent or an anti-school board member vote. It was unanimous that there was no role for bringing that kind of appeal. You lost a vote, and you don't get to appeal it to the State Board. We have local control. Mrs. Green has organized a group called School District Governance Association for New Hampshire. Commissioner Edelblut was the keynote speaker at the group's May meeting. Mrs. Green expressed her appreciation in the newspaper, saying that her organization would strike at the heart of the yes-man culture so prevalent in school districts now. So what you have is school board candidates and some who get elected, as has happened in Sandborn, whose mission, it's called transparency, it could be called budget cutting, it could be called a lot of different things, but is to change the culture of local school boards to empower parents. That sounds like a hard thing to oppose, right? But it has to do with creating many districts, that is, one in each household, rather than a community school system where we educate each other's children. Mrs. Green's appeal to the state board then was an attempt to further her goal by limiting the superintendent's authority to administer the SAU. This commissioner is in strong support and has gone even further, bringing this group forward to sit alongside the New Hampshire School Boards Association, representing those 800 elected school board members. Give this group the same status and authority to comment on plans and participate in the way that normally school board members would in department decision making. So these are things that you probably don't even know what to make of as I'm telling you, as you sit there, right? The public would never really become aware of. They sound like a state board of education arcanian, but they are an incremental step toward changing the fundamental nature of our system. If you populated the Professional Standards Board with as many Ken Gorels as possible, you would change the discussion about teaching in the state. If you empowered and elected more and more school board members who opposed the basic premise of public education, you would change the discussion about public education. So, and there are other fronts, one of which I'll mention in a second. But everyone, so that's on the board, right? And it needs vigilance. We're familiar with the vigilance needed in the legislature. Probably everyone is familiar with House Bill 193, the voucher bill from the last session of the legislature, which will come back in this session. The commissioner helped draft it. The state board chair and I think one other member of the board are strong supporters. Last year the board came out in opposition, and what it does is put adequacy money, if there are $3,000 or $4,000 or $5,000 per child going to your district for adequacy funding, and your child has been a public school student for one semester and goes to a private school, he or she takes that money with them. So that's, and it's to religious schools or not, it's wide open, it's the most universal voucher bill that anyone, there's no income requirements, there's no requirement that your own school is failing in some way, there's nothing. So it's a universal voucher bill, the most aggressive in the country. However, there's a new bill called to revise the manifest educational hardship rule. And not to get into the weeds, but if your child is not being served by your school, maybe it's a special ed need, but it doesn't have to be special ed, it's just any need at all, and you make the case to first your superintendent and then your school board that that's the case. And if the board agrees, your superintendent negotiates a placement with a school that can serve your child's need. and it needs to be another public school. And the state board writes rules pursuant to every education statute, but including the manifest educational hardship statute. Last spring, the commissioner wrote rules that he wanted the board to use instead of those developed by stakeholders and the hearings and the normal process of rule development. And what it did was remove the superintendent as a player, add private schools as an option, as if you could do that in the rules, and make it possible in various detailed ways for almost any parent who asks for this kind of exemption, for any reason, to get it. There wouldn't be any grounds, serious grounds, for a school board to deny this kind of request. And we said, no, 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 that's not going to happen. And so now it's coming back as legislation. And it isn't clear yet what's in the bill. It's only clear that what the bill is about. But it's guaranteed that this same kind of language will not necessarily be in the bill, but be in the debate and be potentially in the bill. And it could be passed from the House and then amended in the Senate with this kind of private school, anything goes kind of language. So, and that is a much more powerful bill, if that's what happens, than the voucher bill. Because if your child leaves to go to another school, he or she takes your tax money, your local tax money, with them, as well as the state adequacy. Yes.
I'm a little unclear, so I don't want to get into those weeds.
No, I like the weeds. I don't want to bore you.
Well, no, you're not boring me, but it's as I'm understanding this child who has needs that might be met in a private school, for example, takes $5,000 of public school money with him or her to that private school. Wouldn't that private school cost more than $5,000?
Okay, so you're putting together two things. The voucher bill would do what you just said.
Right.
And has nothing to do with needs. Just, I feel like going to a private school, and the state will do what you just said. The difference is that the manifest, an arcane sounding, hard to remember, you've never heard of it before unless you're a parent with this kind of concern, kind of bill, could turn out to be much more powerful because
so in other words, more money would go.
That's because more money would go.
If there's like a $15,000 per annum tuition and that child gets $5,000, they have to come up with $10,000 and maybe the state will come up with it.
Yes, how that tuition gets negotiated isn't given or isn't clear, but the school district would have some choices. So it isn't just whatever a private school charges, you must pay. It isn't that. However, if two public schools trade a child, and you're the superintendent of one and I'm the superintendent of the other, we talk. We figure out a proposed tuition for my school to pay, your school to take a child from my school, whose needs we're not meeting, and your school is better able to meet those needs. So that's between two public schools. It's a well-trod path. It's been done frequently. It's not clear what would happen about how much goes to the private school. This is all to be figured out in a legislative process.
It won't work.
Well, whether it'll work is none of that's right. All I'm saying at this point is that it's important to be alert to it. In other words, if you heard about this and I wasn't telling you about it, you might move on to the next article in the paper, right, without realizing how powerful.
Is there any potential that this could apply to homeschooling? If somebody
Yes.
says that
Yeah.
indeed my
Exactly.
child would benefit from homeschooling,
That's right.
therefore I want to take that 16,000 and,
It
go to
would
Europe
be,
or something.
yeah. I wouldn't say that the biggest risk is a homeschool parent will get rich on the, overcharging and this kind of, because the legislators are sensitive to that kind of thing. It's not that they want to do that. The issue is about the choice. The issue is about the fact that a school board, right now there are 3 criteria for establishing what is a manifest educational hardship. And they were set by the Supreme Court in the 70s, our Supreme Court. This proposed rule change that the commissioner made removes those criteria and leaves only one, which is totally debatable, kind of subjective criteria that anybody. So there would no longer be any serious criteria for a school board to deny this kind of request. Do you have a question?
I have a question. Doesn't it raise constitutional issues if you're giving
Yeah.
public money to religious schools?
Yes, and it gets, when we brought the case, that very case, to the state Supreme Court, apropos the bill passed, the voucher bill passed in 2011, the court declined to even figure it out. What they said was, you don't have standing because you weren't harmed. That same legislature had passed a bill that said anybody who wants to sue the state has standing. But the Supreme Court said that bill is unconstitutional and you guys don't have standing. So it hasn't been settled in our Supreme Court, even though intuitively it seems.
It seems like a problem.
Like you said. Herb's been waiting.
Do you know if there's any linkage between some of these initiatives and the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC?
I would say it doesn't matter. I would say both of these, there could have been sample legislation from ALEC, but ALEC collects and disseminates. So sample legislation could have come from any state, and ALEC says, oh, we'll put that in our... These ideas travel, and my own sense is that of these 2 bills that we're talking about, and these will be the biggest deal in this legislature from an education point of view. There are a number of other bills, but this is where the action is, these 2 bills. And I should say the governor said in the last legislature he didn't quite buy into this voucher bill in the last legislature. Whether what his opinion about it in this legislature will be is unclear. But we're a red state from top to bottom now, right? So anything, this is fraught territory. Anything could happen on both of these bills.
Yes, and just to get back to Liz, I think one of the issues was that you're giving a voucher, say, of $3,000 to a private school, which is fine and well if you have the money to pay the rest, but people of lower income cannot pay the rest.
That's right.
So they can't, so that's, it's...
A couple of things happen. The school's retail price
It's a very different.
can be reduced. And the parent may have not enough to reach the retail price, and there are other sources for scholarships. Both the scholarship organization organizing all this and the school could say, we have this great kid who can bring this much, and if you could provide a scholarship for the rest, they could come. So it isn't as simple as that. And there are a number of schools with low tuition, particularly Christian schools. you know, small schools with low tuition.
But in either of these circumstances, either the hardship bill concept, whatever, or the voucher system, and this idea that the money follows the student, which is what you're talking about, correct?
Yes.
Okay. That's money that originally was allocated or was meant to go to the public school.
Yes.
So if you take that child and that child goes to, whether it's public or religious, whatever, a school other than the public school, the money goes out, but the public school is not reimbursed for that amount of money.
No.
Yet, having one student or 5 students leave that public school for other schools
Doesn't reduce the cost.
doesn't reduce the public school costs. They, you know, if they have a class of 28 instead of 30 students, they're paying the teacher to teach those 28 or 30. So this is harm to the whole public school system, because you are literally taking money out of that system, and so something is suffering in the public school system.
Absolutely. And that is not the whole reason not to respond to the siren call of school choice, but it is one key reason that indicates that as time goes on and you stop investing in this community asset and you reduce, not all in one day, but incrementally over time, it can indeed no longer deliver.
Well, and most of them are struggling to begin with,
That's right.
even with what they're getting now.
Exactly. So it's not a viable education strategy in general to make each parent his or her own education system constructing something for their students.
Is there any?
In an even worse case scenario in a town like ours, Southampton, we've been having a decreasing enrollment, and I suspect a lot of communities have been.
Right.
And we have had a maximum of approximately 125 students in our elementary school, and now it's only about 70. So in the worst case scenario, we might have to close our schools, and then our children truly would not have the freedom of a public education, because they wouldn't have the transportation. They would have to find their own education, and that would, you know, be deplorable for families, and it would be devastating for our town and our property values,
Right.
which should appeal to certain people of the other political persuasion.
Kevin wanted to say,
Well, I just, Southampton, of course, is a great example. Newcastle, too, would have, but we should understand that, I think on many levels, this is meant to undermine the public school.
Yeah.
And if we go back to No Child Left Behind, it was meant to undermine the public school. Standardized testing was going to show that the schools were not up to snuff, and it was going to open the doors for the money to go elsewhere. I just think we're still in that mode, and we're trying it under different guise, under different methods, but it's still the same thing. It's meant to, people should understand that. I think Betsy DeVos in some other statements has been quite open that she believes that the public school has undermined the religious community, and that this kind of secularization of education is part of a problem in America, and she would like to have the religiosity restored by having students attend religious schools on public money. But the point is well taken, that doesn't mean that the heat or the light or the teacher or the facility suffers, you know, it suffers a loss. We know that. It's still the same. But I think we really do need to understand that there is an effort here to undermine the public school.
and it's been there, but now it's official. The commissioner and the state board chair.
I guess my other question is, as you take people out, your example of the 32, is there any evidence that the cost actually increases? I mean, for instance, if you have a school
Cost
system
per
that's down-
student increases.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you know, the cost of the community. If you have a school that's going to close down and now they have to tuition out to another place.
Then it could increase, exactly.
So
right.
I guess I'm just wondering if there's any evidence of that.
Well, it's not,
Not that far. It's that far yet.
Yeah, there are probably studies, but the logic that you're suggesting is powerful in itself. In other words, that you're into unknown territory. If you think you're going to save money by shutting down when it's a choice, and you do the study, and I'm familiar with various communities recently who've done that, they find, wait a minute, no, it's not cheaper to go next door. And when you're in a condition where you're already losing enrollment just by demographics, and that's enhanced by the state providing incentives for you to leave, then you just travel further down this road where we actually have no education system. Parents have choices, but we have no, what President Trump, the union leader, and others call it government schools. We have no government schools.
It seems to me it's not a bridge too far to think that the next thing to be done would be to redefine what constitutes a school or an educational institution. And at that point, you really open the door to just anything. And it doesn't sound like that's beyond the capability of the people designing this.
There's another element too, that not only is it to undermine the public school or to enhance the private, but it enhance the profit motive of the other places. But there's also a notion that we want to maintain the cheapest possible costs for a hire, where you can't hire, and school systems are often paid by degree and by the number of degrees, the bachelor's, master's, or the number of credits beyond that, or the number of years they've been teaching. There's a kind of grid that most salary scales have. Think of if you went into the medical office and said, can you give me the cheapest cardiologist you've got? Or if you went to your mechanic and said, well, just give me the cheapest mechanic you got. I don't want to spend too much money on my heart, or I don't want to spend too much money on my car. My brakes. Can you give me the cheapest technician you've got?
Let me quote you what this lovely guy, Vincent Connolly, Kevin may know, others may, that I referred to a few minutes ago, that I talked to Monday, who teaches in the education department at UNH, I said, well, what are the issues you face? And he said, as teachers have been talked down over the last 10 and more years, we get fewer and fewer recruits, fewer people wanting to teach, and we get people wanting a short path into teaching, not going through the whole thing. Then they get into the classroom, and it's hard, and they fail, and they leave. And
huge
so
number.
That's a very concise summary of the state we're in because of this debate about the legitimacy of public education in general. And teachers get to bear the brunt because they personify education from everybody's point of view.
So is the voucher amount determined by a fixed amount in either legislation, or is it based upon a determination of per pupil cost of that school?
In the voucher bill, it's adequacy money. So the formula for adequacy has all these factors, and depending on what bill surfaces when the next bill comes up, it could be a straight amount, $3,600 per child, or it could be if the child is poor, comes from a poor family, has dyslexia, has English as a second language, all of these factors that get added in the adequacy equation could be added to that child's voucher to bring to a school. It's not.
But that money doesn't come from. It's not like an appropriation from the state for that student.
That's what it is.
Oh, it doesn't come out of the school?
That money, that adequacy money, comes from the state, except, and you're getting at an important point here, Laurie's going to tell me we're going on too long. Okay, good. Part of that state money is what you've seen on your local tax bills called statewide education property tax, SWIFT. Right? And it is local tax money recharacterized instantly by statute as state money. Right? So some of the money, $560 million a year, comes from general fund, right? It's all outside the community. $360 million a year comes from SWIFT, comes from your property tax money, characterized as state tax money. So when that child brings it to private school, she is actually bringing some of your local tax money, although it's called SWIFT. And that's one of the debates in the legislature about, is this going to be viable? That's one of the debates that held up the bill from being voted on in the last session.
Just give me those numbers again, the amount from the SWIFT and the amount from the general fund.
Yes, 560, this is approximate because it's driven by enrollment. Enrollment changes every year, but call it 560 million comes from the general fund, and this amount is fixed, just as a legislative happenstance. 365 million approximately dollars comes from the statewide education property tax, SWIFT, which is local property taxes that are figured out on a what's called equalized basis, so that if you pay it in Concord and you pay it in Newcastle and Portsmouth and Exeter, you're paying a fair amount toward the SWIFT. So it's complicated, but it's your money as local tax money. And so there could be technical reasons that will continue or not to stand in the way of the voucher bill, HB 193. And there could be political reasons or technical reasons that would stand in the way of turning the manifest education hardship bill into the ultimate school choice bill. There could be obstacles in all those cases, and that's what people need to be aware of.
Number on that bill?
Pardon me?
Yeah, the
No, it's still a legislative LSR, right? So the LSR number is 2530, but that won't last long. But my point here is, and I brought these sign-up sheets for people, anyone who wants to be alerted when this narrative surfaces in any form, whether it's rulemaking or somebody wants to change the rules to subvert public education. Appointments of the kind that would normally be kind of invisible, because if the state board hears from you in opposition to a given appointment, or maybe an appointment that happened before, but we're paying attention, where you're saying, where nobody's used to you paying attention to what goes on at the state board, right? Or when the legislative, there are going to be key moments in the legislative progress where hearing from a lot of people, not rubber stamp kind of letters, but the real deal that says, I'm informed and I care. That kind of communication is going to be important, because without it, this kind of language about each child matters, we can all agree about this kind of stuff. It's what it means that we might not agree about. And it takes another level of sensitivity to realize that and to know when to weigh in. And I'm going to make sure that everyone who wants to know knows that here's the background. No flag waving, fire breathing advocacy on my part. Just saying, if you're alert to this dynamic that we're talking about, then this would be a great place to weigh in.
That financial breakdown, the 500 million to 365, that apply. You were talking there that applies to the or the money for the voucher program. Is that right?
Yes, that applies to. Every state contributes to education in some way. New Hampshire contributes less than most.
Yeah.
But the amount we contribute is about 8 or 900.
So that's the Claremont solution.
That's the Claremont solution, exactly right. That was developed in response.
But voucher money comes out of that pile. Not the hardship yet.
That's right.
Okay.
The voucher money is just that. Although year to year, people introduce money follows the child kind of legislation. The manifest education hardship doesn't look like that until you get alert to it.
Our town is going through, our school needs to be renovated, and they asked for $25 million, and we lost by 7 votes the first time, and I think it was more like 96 to second. And now one of our members is actually, we had her join the committee that is now working on renovating. Are there monies available? Because it is the student, but it's also the building that needs to be.
Yes.
So I had heard that.
It's changing. That's right. The short answer is that there's about $19 million now available for school buildings, in contrast to the last several years where there hasn't been a penny. So that's the short answer.
And how do you have to ask for it, obviously?
Oh, it's a complex formula that determines which schools get funded, having to do with safety and other matters.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's another aspect. I mean, you can have the
Well,
best teachers, but you have to have a building that's safe as well.
Yes, absolutely. It is the same legislators who support school building aid may also support school choice, right? School building aid has a lot of local support, voter support. So school building aid isn't challenged. There's a lot of opposition to raising revenue of any kind, including the kind that could pay for school building aid. But given that opposition to raising revenue, legislators are willing to look for ways of providing school building aid. And it looks like there will be $20 million available for that, where there was $1 to $3 million available last year, right? Next to nothing. But it wasn't that long ago when if you had a building and you met the formula, you got funded. The state borrowed the money.
I know some people who have done a fantastic job homeschooling their kids, so I'm not disparaging that as a whole.
Yeah.
But I think the notion of these two, the school voucher bill and the manifest educational hardship bill, it seems to me that they're operating under the premise that every parent is capable and/or is going to do as good or better job than the public school system at determining their child's learning needs or learning problems even. So to me, our country has operated under the notion that children deserve and have a right to a free and adequate public education. And if the parent is not capable or deprives the child
Right.
of an adequate education, that child's rights are being, to a good education and to a future, are being deprived. And I just wonder if there's some sort of Supreme Court notion for protecting the rights of the child from inadequate parenting.
That point and your previous point, which I forget right now, are great points that you need to make in the course of this debate. Whenever it might get to a court decision is unknown, some future undertaking. But in this debate over this kind of legislation, I think those are very strong points that you're making, and they need to be part of the public dialogue, and they will have a great impact because they engage the question where the question is. If you take this question seriously and you take it, your other point was about the decreasing, one of your other points was about the decreasing enrollment and what happens if you accelerate that. And your a point similar to the one that Lincoln made, and when you take that dynamic to its extreme, don't you realize that you are undercutting the access of parents who don't have the wherewithal, they already work 24 hours a day just to survive, to never mind home educate, but enter the marketplace for public education and be sophisticated consumers to help put their child on the path that makes sense for their child. This is a very big undertaking that you're expressing the nature of the problem, and parents, voters, taxpayers, teachers, others need to be making those points at the right moments when they could have the most impact. And that's what I'm saying about sign up and I'll mobilize you for that.
Let me just jump in here and we'll take one more question. But in the meantime, we have to pay for the room. So this is a passing the hat time. We're doing a little different.
The Edel movements assuming that they're eventually going to break that resistance down and going to get something passed. I'm alarmed at how few people I know who are mostly parents of grown children who are far out of school and or childless parents and single people that represent a very high proportion of voters, neither know anything about this subject and or care about this subject. Therefore, what is going on in New Hampshire to combat the massive movement towards vouchers?
First, Kevin's pointing at me to talk
Bill
about...
Duncan.
to talk about, probably...
You have a tall job. Do it all on your own.
To talk about Reaching Higher New Hampshire, which is a nonprofit advocating with nonpartisan. It's got Republicans, Democrats, leaders from every sector on the board, and a very strong staff whose job it is to advocate for public education and be a voice. All these years in the past, opponents have been organized. Supporters have said, oh look, my school's great, life is good, there's no need to be organized. And so Reaching Higher is that. And the NEA is before Reaching Higher existed, before any organizations supporting public education existed, the National Education Association, the Business and Industry Association, the BIA, the Statewide Chamber of Commerce, and others were around the table speaking up for public education and saying, this is what we need to be able to do. Superintendents, and now the School Boards Association is there at the ramparts as well, supporting, but it's a disparate group. I've had lawyers call me and say, wait a minute, I'm out there, I'm working for the school boards, I'm doing this, and I can see that the whole thing is blowing apart. What can I do and my peers do? So there's a lot of interest in, because in the past, it's all been positive. The department has been positive, the State Board of Education has been positive, and supportive parents have felt that they could pay attention to their jobs, their kids, and their family. Now, when we have a commissioner who many people opposed his appointment and recognize what we're talking about, a State Board of Education that's getting new appointments and could change, more people are alerted. And years ago, when we talked about the standards, Common Core standards as a political debate, it was good. We prevailed, teachers cared, everyone cared, and it's well done in our schools, so we prevailed, and the good standards are in place. But it was hard to mobilize people because life was good. Now there's an urgency. Now there is a real urgency, a real threat, and people are readier to be mobilized than ever before. So, your non-voting friends who care about, not non-voting, your friends who are no longer parents with kids at school, have an opportunity to protect a public good that they'll recognize as a public asset that needs protection.
And yes, I have encountered plenty. My kids are like, have been out of the school system for eons, but still, support the school, and I know that many do not. Is there any legislation for fixed incomes, people are asking? Like some people say, well, I'm on a fixed income, I can't afford.
I know. There is no such, it would be local.
Yeah.
And of course, there's been a debate here in Exeter about the exemption. It's not the old age exemption, it's called something else. But so that's the kind of debate, and they are local debates. But those are age-old debates. You can find ways to support the schools within those debates.
So you can change that a town can change that?
The town does change that. Yes. That's where the ability to do that is on.
Yeah, just to follow on that, I happen to have been calling some local communities to find out, because when I was selectman, we did make some changes to help elderly people. And it is such a vast range from communities like Farmington or others where the exemption might be $200 or $300 to multiple thousands of dollars in other communities. So you would need to contact your Board of Selectmen to try to get something on the agenda and get a warrant article. 25 signatures and you can make some changes like that.
Bill, I don't want to get away from this topic if there are more questions, but we had the pleasure of having you come to Southampton a few months back, and you talked about the current board possibly undermining the Common Core, and that it was developed by teachers, created these standards and the teachers liked it, and I wondered what's happening there.
One of Commissioner Edelbluth's first initiatives was to, thank you, was to state that although the state board is responsible for the standards, it's like making rules. The state board is responsible. He nonetheless was going to review the current standards, English, math, and science, which the state board has adopted just a few months ago. We had a big fight about it over months. And the result was he backed off the science standards. And on the English and math, we voted, well, he didn't back off, we voted unanimously on the board that we would not reopen the science standards. And anybody, you, or the commissioner, or anybody in the state can review and critique the standards if they want. And you can, commissioner, spend your staff time on that if you want. But the board, which is the rulemaking authority, is not going to reopen those standards. On English and math, the fight was separate, or the debate was separate. And superintendents, the business community, teachers, parents, we had over 100 people come to, over a couple of meetings, come to public comment and talk about how well the standards are working and how there was no need to reopen the standards. And so I forget what the vote was in the case of English and math, but it was the same thing. If you want to do your own independent review, can't stop you from doing that, but the board itself will not do it. So the message to Kevin and all his compatriots is these standards are not under threat. As the board changes, vigilance is required. And that vote could change. I go off, but currently, that's the case.
Okay, so this has been an excellent presentation. So thank you everybody for coming. We have the rooms for the whole evening, so if you want to hang around and talk about it or whatever, you're welcome to. But thank you very much for coming.